Welcome everyone to Treasure Hunt. As I said, kind of at the beginning, given the group that we have this morning, I think I'll dispense the normal introductions. I think we all are familiar with, what we do when we come together here, study the earliest texts of the Buddhist tradition, and we have. For quite a while now, if you count up the number of classes we've had so far, I think this is number 11 on just the Satipatthana Sutta itself. The sutta normally translated as Foundations of Mindfulness. We have proceeded through the first three of the four Satipatthana, first three foundations or applications, themes, you might say. And we're entering what is called the Dhammas, the fourth Satipatthana, which is really a collection of five teachings. Five teachings that we find elsewhere in the tradition. Those teachings are made up of the Five Hindrances. That's what we'll be discussing this morning. Following that are sections on also what are called the five aggregates. And after that, the six sense gates, the seven factors of awakening, and then finally the fifth is the Four Noble Truths. And maybe one thing to say just about all this complexity, that you find in the early tradition. If our minds are not inclined to try to go back to school, you might say, these teachings can seem like too much work, right? Given the other things that we try to balance and keep track of in our lives. If we want simplicity, we really value simplicity, then honestly, these teachings might not be a good fit. So this seems important for me to point out because consciously or unconsciously, we may want and expect that the spiritual vehicle be something along the lines of a tricycle, something simple and manageable, right? We pedal, we steer, and that's the extent of it. But the way that I've come to view the early teachings with all their lists and pieces and parts, it's like getting acclimated instead to driving a car. Sure, there is the steering wheel, and there's the go pedal, and there's the stop pedal, just like a tricycle. But as we all know, there's also the turn signal, the headlights, the GPS, the windshield wipers, the seat belts, cruise control, AC, heater, all the gauges and the dials, it goes on and on, especially these days. So kind of like it is with all the parts of a modern car, we have this array of teachings. And what we can do with them, though, is become familiar with their basic functions, become familiar with the different ways in which they can help us. And perhaps it helps to consider this, just like we don't try to use all of the parts of a car at once, right? We don't have to put all the teachings into use at one time either, right? But as we become skilled in the parts of the path, we start to get a feel for, when the time is right, what conditions call for the use of a particular teaching, right? And we can put the right teaching to use at the right time. So there is a learning curve, but over time, as we experiment with the diversity of teachings, we see how they actually apply in our lives and help us. This is important. When we have the experience of the teachings actually helping us, it's no longer of a matter of trying to keep a burdensome list of concepts in our heads. Right? It's no longer a burden. Instead, this array of teachings becomes enlivening. They become a source of confidence. And furthermore, just like we can more or less, drive a car without, having to think hard about everything. As we work with this array of teachings, we develop what you might think of as a muscle memory. They become the direction that our minds naturally lean. They become the mind's first responders, you might say. So the reason I'm saying this is that, it's an important challenge in working with the early teachings, I believe. Something to get out on the table, because it's, I get it. It's easy to get overwhelmed. And then at that point, we might get turned off and walk away. But I hope not. So you're here. So let's, like I said, this morning we're going to get into the first of the 5 Dhammas, the 5 hindrances. And I would like to share my screen. Am I allowed to do that? I have the permission. Okay, can everybody see this? So here we have the section on the 5 hindrances that occur in this translation from Thanissaro Bhikkhu. I will read it. You can follow along. And how does a monk remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves? So it says, there is the case where a monk remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the 5 hindrances. And how does a monk remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the 5 hindrances? There is a case where, there being sensual desire present within, a monk discerns, there is sensual desire present within me. Or, there being no sensual desire present within, he discerns, there is no sensual desire present within me. He discerns how there is the arising of unarisen sensual desire, and he discerns how there is the abandoning of sensual desire once it has arisen. And he discerns how there is no further appearance in the future of sensual desire that has been abandoned. And then this is Thanissaro's note that the same approach, the same formula is taken with the remaining hindrances: ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and anxiety, and uncertainty. And then below that, we have the refrain, that we engage in this aspect, this approach of mindfulness internally for ourselves, externally with other people, focusing on phenomena of origination, passing away. And then here's near the end, here's what I think of as the fruit of working in this fashion. He remains independent, unsustained by, not clinging to anything in the world. So that's the text. And then just a little background about the hindrances themselves. In the early tradition, the hindrances are portrayed as being those actions of mind, being those activities of mind that hinder concentration. And in particular, they hinder what are called the jhanas. These are particular states of concentration, highly concentrated states of concentration, you might say. In a text called, or in a text within the collection called the Anguttara Nikaya, 551, the Buddha says that the hindrances, they overwhelm the mind and weaken wisdom just as if a great river, deep and wide, would lose its force, if people divert it in different directions. Right? Great river gets diverted, it loses its power and force. In another text in the middle length discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya, 43:20, it's said that the abandonment of the five hindrances leads to jhana. Jhana being portrayed as sustained reflection, pleasure, and unification of mind. Now, the jhanas were an incredibly important part of the path. The idea being that deep clarity and calmness that we come into in jhana leads to clear seeing. And what we see are the subtlest disturbances of the mind. We see the large ones, the gross ones at first, but within jhana we come to see the very subtlest concoctions and fabrications. And within jhana we leave behind layer after layer of disturbance, and we come into, we open up to layer after layer of freedom. Now, even if as lay practitioners, rather than monastics, we aren't ideally positioned to come into jhana, although there are lay practitioners like us who do. The Five Hindrances are still a really helpful framework to name what often characterizes our mental environment. They provide a basic vocabulary for a large swath of our inner experience. Now, we may not get into jhana, but this part of the practice can get us in a very good habit of working our way out of the major and minor head trips we might create within ourselves. This part of the practice helps us to get into the great habit of snapping out of the little worlds that we get ourselves caught in, or snapping out of the worlds that other people would have us get caught in. Okay, there is this freedom from identification, freedom from clinging, that's pointed out in the refrain of the sutta, and it can be a huge relief. So I like to think of it that we learn to interact with the hindrances kind of like we might learn to interact with waves on the beach. We learn how not to get harmed, not to get slammed by them, driven into the sand. We have this ability to dive into the waves and come out the other side, unharmed. And, the other part of this little simile is that, once we are able to swim out beyond the crashing waves and get into the deep water, that's a little more in line with what a jhanic state would be like. So this is the setup. We've got the five hindrances, and then we've got these five inquiries, or reflections that go along with each one. The hindrances are desire or attraction. The second is ill will, anger. The third is torpor. Then there's restlessness and doubt. Then the part that's the part of the teachings that is mixed in with that is that we make clear for ourselves. We know whether the hindrance is present. We make clear for ourselves whether the hindrance, or if the hindrance is not present. And third, we make ourselves clear how it arises, and then how it is abandoned. And finally, we make clear for ourselves, how it is prevented. You may note the similarity between this framework and the last Satipatthana, the mind. Right, with the mind, with mind states, we discerned whether they were present or not, and then in the refrain, it had us determine, how they arise and how they pass away. But with the hindrances, with this, when we come into this part of the teachings, there's a twist. Now we're to know how the hindrances not only pass away, but how they're to be abandoned. And furthermore, how they're to be prevented. And this kind of language can raise some concerns and some alarm bells with people. And I'm going to be getting into that, later in the talk. But just to say for now that what I think we have here are elements of right effort coming to the foreground, in the practice, right? Abandoning what is not helpful and keeping it from bothering us in the future. So there are these 5 hindrances, simply put. They are the mental qualities, again, that prevent, that hinder peace and composure, and they go on to hinder understanding. The first is sense desire, which is that gravitational attraction we feel, not to all pleasure, but to the more mundane forms of pleasure. So we are encouraged to develop within us and make reliable otherworldly pleasures, as it's sometimes called, pleasures of the mind, pleasures we can make available to us within ourselves, kind of like what we were doing a little bit in the introductory meditation this morning. So with the hindrances, the sense desire, again, refers mainly to these sorts of mundane, transitory pleasures. The second hindrance is aversion, or sometimes translated as ill will or anger. So these energies are also a kind of wanting, but instead of wanting something to come and to stay, it's a wanting of something to go away and to stay away. Two sides of the same coin. Then there's sloth and torpor. This is being physically or mentally lethargic. Sloth is that energy that would just not rather bother with trying to get something done, and torpor is an unhelpful lack of energy. The mind sinks. Next is restlessness, anxiety and worry. This is a little bit of the opposite of the prior one. It's being physically or mentally fidgety, or amped up. It's an excessive, unhelpful amount of energy. And the fifth is doubt. And as I've said before in prior talks, I think doubt is one of the most interesting of all of these, because it can sometimes hide itself. We may not recognize it as doubt immediately. So, for example, one part of our mind sees the value of settling the attention in the present moment, but maybe another part of the mind doesn't trust that that's a good use of our time and energy. Right? Doubt is what makes us think we should be doing something else, thinking about something else. Doubt is what makes you want to get up off of the cushion a little sooner than you had intended to. It's that voice that says, I'm no good at this, or this isn't working, right? And as you may know, questioning is an excellent part of the path. It is part of the path, testing the teachings to see, what works at certain times is excellent. But the trick with doubt is that it's an undercutting, impatient mistrust. And so those are the 5 hindrances themselves, and woven into this outline are what I think of as the 5 discernments, or the 5 reflections. You might think of it as an expression of what's called anupassana, right? It's the contemplation that you may remember we encountered back in the introductory part of the sutta. We contemplate all of these things that we've brought to mind. And if you happen to also be familiar with the 7 factors of awakening, again, which we're going to be getting into a little later, you'll recall that the very first factor of awakening is mindfulness. Followed right up after that is investigation. So we bring something to mind and then we investigate it, right? We reflect on it. We explore it. This is a treasure hunt, right? And something to keep in mind that I hope is helpful. We hear so often about focusing on the breathing, and that is a fundamental aspect of the practice. But what I think we have available to us here in this part of the practice is to make the hindrance the actual theme of the meditation. Right? It's not just, this is something we can do alongside awareness of the breathing in the body, but they become the themes of mindfulness. Right? They become the themes of our contemplation. And again, it's not that we have to track all of these 5 times 5, 25 options all at once. Instead, you might think of it as, something more along the lines of a body scan, right? If you're familiar with that meditation technique, right? We focus here, we focus there, we move around. Maybe we end up settling in one spot, or maybe we don't. But it can involve a certain kind of mental agility, mental nimbleness that is helpful if we are able to get good at it. So the very first discernment that goes along with each of the 5 hindrances is that we know if a hindrance is present. All right. It can be interesting as a method of practice to sort of slowly, methodically go down the list. Right. Again, just like you were doing a body scan, and then ask, am I being impacted by desire, aversion, sloth, worry, or doubt? And you may have had your own experience of this. It can sometimes just in and of itself be a great help to simply be clear about what you're having a hard time with, in a broad brush way. Waking up and saying, oh, yes, this is craving. That's simply what this is. This is the mind craving. And sometimes that enough can be, that in and of itself can be enough to help us wake up out of the clinging and identification. But it can also be worthwhile, I think, to inquire what each of the hindrances is, at the micro level. So we can figure out, what each hindrance is made of specifically, what goes into us labeling an experience as one hindrance rather than another. Why do we know that one is one and another is another? What particular emotions and mental activities happen with each one? What particular internal narratives and chatter, might go along with each one? What movies, what's the soundtrack? What images does each create? What situations from the past or the future does the mind conjure up? Here's an interesting one too. What self images might a hindrance be trying to uh, create or defend? Or what self images might a hindrance be trying to avoid? So those are some examples of just how we might deconstruct and investigate just not the presence of a hindrance, but what it's made of exactly. And in sticking with this, over time, sticking with this in a meditation um, can become a form of concentration, right? It's easy to get, might be easy to get uh, off track, hit the exit ramp unconsciously, and you're in a thought world, and to bring your mind back to just the pure contemplative reflection of what it is. So that's the tricky part of this to keep in mind. It can become a thought exercise rather than a real contemplation. So the second discernment is that we know if a hindrance is not present. And again, in going down the list, it can be easy to check the box and just simply say, right, you're not here. But at times, however, it can be really rewarding to settle into the fact that the mind is relaxed in a way that it might more often be disturbed. Some of you may be familiar with how neuroscience shows that we have this negativity bias, right? In Rick Hanson's book, Buddha's Brain, he uses this phrase that our minds are like Velcro for negative experience and Teflon for positive experience. So, especially if we have what I like to think of as a favorite hindrance, one that really dogs us consistently, it can be helpful to realize when there's a pause in it. For whatever reason, just wake up to the fact that we're not being bothered by something that might normally bother us, and let that sink in. Right? Be clear for ourselves what kinds of thoughts are not obsessing the mind. What uncomfortable body sensations might we not be experiencing? And we can look on these periods with gratitude. That the mind is not pestering itself in a way that it might typically like to pester itself. And here's another, I think, really helpful aspect of this. If you're staying mindful and alert to a hindrance's absence, it's easy to catch it when it starts to stir. Right? You can notice the subtle shifts in energy, the pre-thoughts, you might say, that mark the arising of the hindrance. But, even if anger or worry or whatever it is does find a gap, and take over for a moment, if your intention was to stay mindful of the hindrance's absence, it's more possible that you catch it immediately, or at least more quickly than normal, so that it doesn't have a chance to gain a firm footing and gain momentum. So that's the second. And the third discernment is that we know how the hindrance arises. Here, we're exploring what's called conditionality. That is, what causes what. And with this, we clue into the causes of whatever hindrance we're experiencing. We can engage in that reverse engineering we talked about in the last class. We can deconstruct the chain of events that led to the hindrance arising in the first place. So, for example, in our practice, we can figure out why anxiety is arising. You know, personally, I think it's okay to engage in a little contemplative thinking when we're doing this. You know, we can ask, you know, what is the mind trying to achieve as it engages in anxiety? You know, what's the draw? What's the allure? You know, what is the mind wanting to have happen as it's doing this or that? You know, our minds and our karma are complex, and it's not uncommon that our wanting, that our clinging, you know, has many layers. Um, some of my friends here refer to this as peeling back the layers of the onion, right? But if we can, you know, get into those layers, if we can dive under all those waves of frantic thinking, you know, the physical unrest, you know, there's a real transition. You know, this often takes patience, you know, and it can sometimes take a great deal of honesty because sometimes it's not flattering what we find ourselves wanting, right? We may have to, along the way, in addition, you know, confess some of our rationalizations, confess some of our justifications. But whatever it is, I think that the key is to discover the particular point of clinging, right? At some point, we want to become very particular about what it is we're clinging to. And again, even just sometimes being clear about what it is can be enough for all the clamor to subside. There is another really interesting and I think important aspect of all this, you know, alongside the deconstruction, you might say, the exploring of conditionality. And that's pointed out in one section in a collection of texts called the Anguttara Nikaya. In one part called the abandoning of the hindrances, there's one thing that the section points out, and I think it's so important. And what it says is that attraction, aversion, and doubt arise because of what's called ayoniso manasikara. That's the Pali word. The English translation is often along the lines of careless attention or unwise attention. And what this means is that we fall into attraction, aversion, and doubt because we give our attention over to something, or we pay attention to something in a particular way such that it doesn't do us any good. You know, and again, there are definitely layers to this as well. You know, I like to quote that saying, you know, when a pickpocket sees a saint, he sees the saint's pockets. Right? And what this means is that, you know, we see something and often we're primed out of habit to have picked up on it. Right? We sometimes think that experience, that awareness is just happening, but what this teaching has us do is to take a step back and say, what was it that led me to want to pay attention to something to begin with? So if I'm walking down the sidewalk, just as one mundane example, you know, there are multiple things that I could pick up on and pay attention to. You know, I could look at my phone as I'm walking. That's what I could that's what I could be paying attention to. I could pay attention to the people around me. I could pay attention to all the displays in the shop windows. I could pay attention to the sensations of walking, right? So there are many, as you might start to intuit here, there are many different ways of experiencing walking, depending, again, on what we pay attention to. And of course, there's another aspect of all this, and that is that there is this relentless knocking on our door, you might say, people trying to get our attention in all different formats, right? People want us to pay attention to them or to some idea or commodity, that they're waving in front of our face. And so in the midst of all this, I think it's important to remember that in the early teachings, we don't encounter the idea of bare attention. In the earliest teachings, the Buddha never taught bare attention. Instead, again, he taught yoniso manasikara, careful attention, wise attention, because it matters, what we pay attention to and how we pay attention to it. So if that's the case, once we take that on, then one question to reflect on in any given moment is, whether what we're paying attention to is doing us any good, or is it bringing about some sort of unbenefit or harm, Another question is, could I be looking at something differently? Could I look at something in such a way that in the same situation, the external environment is the same. So the question is, could I create a sense of ease rather than dis-ease depending on what I pay attention to? Okay, so the fourth discernment is that we know how a hindrance is abandoned. And as I said before, this isn't about just how a hindrance happens to pass away, because as the Buddhists like to say, all things are impermanent. Instead, it's a reflection on right effort, I think. That is how we set aside things that don't help. Sometimes a hindrance can simply be set aside by the clear seeing of it, and realizing in a particular moment, this is not necessary. Or, we might realize that there's nothing profound, particularly, about what we've gotten ourselves attached to. It's simply more of a habit that our minds have gotten into. So we can change the subject, change the channel or turn the page, however you want to think of it. Another thing that has helped me in my practice is remembering something along the lines of one of the sages from Saturday Night Live, Rosanna Dana. She'd go on and on about something, and then eventually, her line at the end was, "It's always something," right? If you remember, there's always something that the mind could be upset about, and you may discover within yourself, I've discovered it within my own, that there are some parts of the mind that just aren't really interested in being chill. They're looking for some sort of a problem to solve. Maybe it's not out of a sense of just discontent, but you're on the lookout because you just want to make sure nothing bad happens. And so there's that sort of chronic dis-ease. So if we can wake up to that, might be a little more easier for us to just, or to have another part of the mind say, enough of this, it's just not something that I need, at least not right this moment. That being said, though, just as often though, these hindrances, they are more tenacious. They're not something that can be wished away, or and we certainly don't want to pretend that something is not there when it really is. Our clinging, to whatever it is, can be deep. It can be habitual, built up over a lifetime. We might also think of it as being, evolutionary in nature. Some of these forms of desire and aversion are biological. It's about survival, or at least some perceived aspect of survival. Even social status. It's not just vanity. It's a biological reaction to wanting to stay safe within our social environment. What we need to do then, I think, just in my own experience, is to have multiple approaches. So one thing is we can reflect on the harm. We can reflect on the drawbacks of maintaining whatever attachment that it is. We might also realize that whatever particular clinging it is impersonal. It's not just about my particular life story. These are things that tend to be woven deeply within the human condition. We might also share our experiences with friends. Share our experience in the company of friends. The Buddha made put a great deal of emphasis on having quality friendships. So just sharing difficulties with friends can help bring about a release that we may not be able to find, working on our own. Another approach that we might try is to just intentionally replace a hurtful desire or habit with some sort of a skillful aspiration. We don't have to leave beneficial states of mind to chance. Right? Instead, we can be proactive and make them strong. We can reflect on those mental qualities, those mental capabilities that inspire us. But again, even with all that, sometimes we encounter things that, they just won't move. They won't budge. Whatever desire or anger, whatever is there, it is not going anywhere. It's not going away. So the best we might be able to do in any situation like that is to rest in clear comprehension. What can help at this point is to be clear. This is dukkha. Right? This is what the Buddha was talking about in the First Noble Truth. This is what he was saying, and then then that can become actually the theme of our meditation. Clear comprehension of dukkha. And even within that, there can be a kind of peace, a kind of release from clinging, a release from the binds of the hindrance. Something else that might help us negotiate this terrain is to consider the diversity of this mind of ours. 2,500 years ago, in the Samyutta Nikaya 22, verse 100, I think I quoted this in a recent class. The Buddha said, "The mind is more variegated, more diverse than the animal kingdom." And, you know, over the years, people have found different ways, you know, other ways of portraying this. You know, there's the image of the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, right? The Cherokee Nation, they have this parable of the two wolves. You know, we often speak of having mixed emotions. Thanissaro Bhikkhu speaks of the mind being composed of a committee, right? We know what committees can be like. So all this speaks to, I think, ambivalence. You know, different parts of the mind, they want different things. You know, part of the mind wants peace, wisdom, and kindness, but other parts of the mind want stimulation. You know, and we toggle back and forth between this and that. You know, it's not just left or right, it's left, right, up, down, forward, backwards, upwards, downwards. You know, it's, you know, we spin, we twist, we turn, we squirm. So here's where, you know, in order to let go, it may help to clarify the different voices. You know, we can take time in meditation to be clear for ourselves, you know, why we go for certain things. Why do we go after it? You know, things that disturb the mind rather than create peace. You know, we can take time to be, you know, honest with ourselves. You know, what's the allure of what it is that I'm being drawn to? And what happens is, you know, we might see that part of the mind accepts disturbance because in some sort of trade-off, it gets something out of it. You know, I was once having a discussion with a Dharma friend of mine about renunciation, you know, which usually has a pretty bad reputation. And but I was providing a positive portrayal of it. And at one point, she just stopped me and she said, "You know, I want to want what I want, because if I don't want it, I won't get it." Right. So that might be the conundrum we find ourselves in. You know, we relish and we find delight in some sort of object or activity, but, you know, let's be clear about that. But alongside the drawbacks, but rather alongside that, we can also take time in meditation to make ourselves aware of the drawbacks. You know, make ourselves aware of certain things that create disturbance, and reacquaint ourselves with why we're on this path. You know, remind ourselves of what kind of mind we really would like. So one question we might ask ourselves is, what is my mind valuing? You know, what is my mind making important when I'm in the midst of some sort of attraction or restlessness, for example? You know, check this out and see if it's true, you know, for yourself. Try this in practice and check it out. That the mind makes what it wants. At some level, it makes what it wants. It creates what it values. And given that this mind is diverse, we have a mix of value systems, right? So as a part of this practice, we may have one aspect of the mind talking another aspect of the mind into wanting something better for itself. I think that a large part of this path is to feed the value systems that help us. You know, we don't have to keep giving the microphone to the loudest voice in our heads. You know, we can ironically give the microphone to that part of the mind that doesn't want to say anything. You know, that's not inclined to chatter or rant or gripe. In the Dhammapada, in verse 290, it says that if by giving up a lesser happiness, one could experience a greater happiness, a wise person would renounce the lesser to behold the greater. So that's all that renunciation is about in the Buddhist tradition. It's not about denying ourselves pleasure. Instead, it's about constantly trading up. And then there's this too, which I think is just a very interesting idea, although it might sound odd at first. Again, in the Dhammapada, verse 277, it says, all conditioned phenomena are dukkha. When one sees this with the eye of wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with suffering. Again, odd that we could become enchanted with suffering. But it's not so much that we want to feel outright pain. What I think this points to is how we're willing to live with a variety of diseases of the mind because we get some sort of happiness, however meager, in return. So I think it's a real turning point to see to see the dukkha of engaging in the hindrances, and also see the value and the peace and clarity that comes from being released from them. The fifth and final inquiry is that we should know, how the hindrance is prevented. This is about how we don't have to sit back and wait on our heels, I think, for the hindrance to make an appearance. Instead we can be proactive, again, about creating positive options for the mind. In one of his teachings, the Buddha said, whatever you frequently think and dwell upon, that will be the inclination of the mind. So as part of this practice, we can actively reflect on the qualities of mind that we do value. Right? We can actively reflect, what sort of mind would I like to have? What things do I want to have become a helpful, automatic inclination? What do we want to make strong and reliable within ourselves? Something we can carry around with us and know are there, be confident in, no matter what the situation is. So to start to wind down here, I want to address this this common concern that many people have, and that you may be experiencing right now as we came to the last couple reflections, about abandoning and preventing. I was thinking back to how I was once sharing these 5 reflections with a Dharma friend of mine who happens to be a psychologist. And so when I got to that part about abandoning and preventing, she very quickly interjected and said, that sounds like suppression. And this is a common reaction, for the alarm bells to go off, not just among psychologists, right? So, these notions, excuse me, that we should abandon and prevent, certain thoughts, feelings, and emotions. It feels like we're not just doing something unhealthy. It feels like we're denying, alienating integral, core parts of our human nature. That can be, the concern. That can be the intuitive sense. It's just the reality, right? If that's the case, I'm not here to talk anybody out of it. That's not what I want to try to do this morning. But at the same time, I would invite you to investigate, experiment in your practice with the view that instead of thoughts and emotions being part of a self, things that make me human, consider instead that the hindrances are activities, that thoughts and emotions are activities, passing systems, flickering events in the mind. We'll have an opportunity to talk more about this in the very next class because we'll be talking about what the Buddha called the khandhas, often translated as aggregates, but also heaps or bundles. What these are collections of cobbled together phenomena that the Buddha says that we mistakenly construe and cling to as a self, or as aspects of a self, or as part of an I or a me. And thoughts and emotions, they fall into this range. They fall within this this category of being aggregates. So that being said, we should definitely keep track of whether or not we're engaging in suppression. That is pretending something is not happening when it really is. If we're in the habit of turning away from what's difficult, it is important to do our best to be with it instead, to the degree that we have that capacity. It's just that in the Buddhist tradition, they ask us to take the next step. And that's after we've understood something deeply, understood what's going on. We don't have to just sit there and be a victim of that particular habit. We don't have to hand over the reins to the chronic activities of the mind that cause us harm. So it's a real paradigm shift, away from the idea that we're suppressing parts of a self, and instead, move in the direction of release, release of all that burdens us. Again, not something to take on belief, but something to experiment with. And so to finally wrap things up, here are just a few thoughts on how to work with this teaching. So first, in your formal practice, in your daily activities, pick your favorite hindrance, right? The one that, for whatever reason, tends to come up the most, and then keep it in mind, use the 5 inquiries to work with it. Really drill down. Again, it can become a form of concentration. Sticking with it and not letting the mind slip off of it. Alongside of that, you might pick a situation in which you normally get triggered, and be proactive about reflecting on it. Explore what it might take to not get triggered. What would allow that to happen? Try to see what brings about disturbances and try to see what helps to calm those disturbances. You can also give yourself little pep talks about, wanting to be composed instead of agitated. Right? With all of these methods, and those are just a few. Come up with some on your own. But whatever the case, think of it as that you're developing a skill. Right? It's something that you can get good at. And not just in one particular kind of circumstance. This is a skill set that's transferable to other situations. So this little array, the 5 by 5 array that we just talked about here, it's a very rich exploration or area of exploration. I think play around with it. Just like a cook might play around in the kitchen, try new things, see what works. Um, I, I think it could be very fruitful in your practice. So that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. I went on a little longer than I had hoped, but I hope this is helpful. Thank you for your time.